Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its mission? To explore strange new worlds, to discover new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Star Trek is one of those shows that captured the imagination, and with its run from 1966 to 1969, it was the perfect time for people to be fascinated with space. After all, this was in the middle of the space race, and the Apollo 11 moon landings happened in 1969, the last year the original series of Star Trek beamed on televisions with new episodes. In fact, after the last episode aired on June 3rd, 1969, it was only a month later that Apollo 11 landed on the moon on July 20th. Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry and starred William Shatner as Captain Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy, James Doohan as Scotty, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, George Takei as Sulu, and Walter Koenig as Chekhov. This was a cast that everyone fell in love with. However, although the show was pretty cheesy and most of the action scenes are quite laughable, the show introduced several stories that dealt with allegory and deep philosophical questions. It also not only captured the amazement with space, but the questions we should be asking ourselves. Plus, the show was a pioneer in diversity and inclusivity, including the first televised kiss between an African American and white American, according to the Jim Crow Museum. These were many of the reasons the show was a massive hit, and fans enjoyed this show so much that it spawned spin-offs, movies, books, and launched an entire franchise that created the great debate amongst nerds of which is better, Star Wars or Star Trek. But Star Trek also spawned many video game adaptations that continue today, but arguably the first video game based on Star Trek was made all the way back in 1971. I say arguably as there are supposedly earlier Star Trek games, but I have not been able to find concrete evidence of this beyond word of mouth. The paper trail leads back to Mike Mayfield's Star Trek in 1971. Welcome to Memory Card, the history of video games, where we take a chronological look at video game history. We've started at the beginning and are continuing our way through history, looking at major games, consoles, events, and people, and looking at them through a microscope to see why they are so important to how they helped make video games what they are today. For this episode, we take a look at the first Star Trek video game. Mike Mayfield was a senior in high school, and he often visited the University of California in Irvine, where he was teaching himself how to program. A computer lab at the university housed a SDS Sigma 7 and DEC PDP-10 mainframe computer that contained a copy of a video game, Space War. We actually covered Space War in a previous episode, so I definitely recommend checking out that previous episode so you can kind of get full context. Mayfield was inspired by Space War and wanted to make his own game in the same vein. Because the Sigma 7 could only access a teletype Model 33 ASR and Space War required a vector graphics display, he needed to create a game that could work better for a teleprinter. Mayfield talked about the history of the Star Trek video game when he sent Games of Fame a message. Quote, "Back in 1971, I was a senior in high school. My school didn't have any computers, but I had managed to, quote, use an account on a Sigma 7 at University of California, Irvine. I was trying to teach myself BASIC from a book. At the time, there was a program that ran on a vector graphics terminal on the Sigma 7 that was a simple shoot-'em-up space war game. I wanted to make a game like that, but I only had access to an ASR-33 teletype non-video terminal. This was back when Star Trek was hot. A bunch of my other geek friends from high school and I spent a lot of hours brainstorming what we could do if we didn't have a video terminal. Since I was the only one in the group that had any knowledge of computers, we ended up coming up with a lot of unimplemented ideas. One idea that did stick was the idea of printing a galactic map and a star map to give you some idea what to shoot at and having phasers reduce power exponentially, like they would if they shot in all directions. It may seem pretty simple now, but for a bunch of high school kids in the early 70s, it seemed pretty cool. So as we just took a look at, Mayfield had met with a group of friends, and many of the ideas just weren't really working out, but Mayfield did like one, and that was a game based on Star Trek. Mayfield immediately began working on the game all the way through his high school graduation. Later that year, the staff at a Hewlett-Packard office let him use a HP 2000C minicomputer in the hopes that he could make his Star Trek game for the computer. Seeing as how the programming language was different, Mayfield had to start from scratch. The game was finished in October 1972, according to the Register. At this point, Mayfield's creation caught the eyes of David Ahl, who saw the game in HP's public domain library. Ahl would go on to create a third version of the game using the Digital Equipment Corporation's programming. Once he completed it, it was published in the DEC User Society newsletter, and that caught the attention of many fans that wanted a Star Trek game on their computers. We haven't talked much about David Ahl yet, so this is a good chance to. Ahl is an author who founded the Creative Computer magazine and also wrote Basic Computer Games, which was the first computer book to sell more than 1 million copies, according to Wikipedia. In 1950, Ahl was at Melbourne Junior Senior High School in Long Island, and he was part of the school's photography club. On a field trip to New York City, Ahl became fascinated with what was known as Radio Row, which would later be demolished to make room for the World Trade Center in the 60s, according to an article in Creative Computing. Radio Row was known for having all kinds of old electronics, and in several months, Ahl started a radio repair business himself. After he had gained further exposure to electronics and computers at Cornell in the late 50s, in the early 70s, he joined the Digital Equipment Corporation. A few years into his employment, however, the United States economy was not doing well, and DEC had to make cuts, which included Ahl, but the vice president of R&D at DEC asked Ahl to be a part of his group. Shortly thereafter, Ahl wrote 101 basic computer games, which would become a staple in video game history, and we'll go over the connection with this book and Star Trek a little bit later in this episode. However, that is not where the history of the 1971 Star Trek ends. Bob Leadham also sent an email to Games of Fame detailing his side of developing a game for the Data General Nova 800. It was 1974, and Leadham was working on porting Space War, aka Star Trek, onto the Nova. Quote, "It was really the first Star Trek program I'd ever seen, and I was excited about getting it to run. Unfortunately, the program used a foreign version of BASIC, and I had to figure out the string manipulation code and translate it to the Data General BASIC syntax. After I converted the code to Data General's version of BASIC and got the game running, various friends would come in to play and enjoy it with me. But as engineers, we were full of, what if you could do this ideas. My buddies would make the suggestions and then disappear, and the next night I'd have a new version available. As it turned out, we very seldom finished a game because our enjoyment was primarily that of adding new features and trying them out. Leadham then wrote to the newspaper People's Computer Company talking about this new port of the game. David Ahl saw this letter in the newspaper and requested a copy from Leadham. Ahl then published the game in the Creative Computing magazine as Super Star Trek. After this point, Ahl wrote a new version of 101 basic computer games that contained Super Star Trek alongside other computer games such as Chomp, Civil War, Hexapon, Hammurabi, and Nim. Some of these we actually covered in the first episode. And Leadham notes that he received several phone calls for several years. Quote, 101 basic computer games must have sold all over the world because for 15 years after it came out, I got letters from most of the USA, plus England, Australia, and a few other countries. I answered them all, and in several cases struck up ongoing exchanges with some of the correspondents. Leadham's version, still known as Super Star Trek, became the main game in the book, so much so that Sears Telegames created a version for the Atari 2600 known as Stellar Track. IBM also shipped a version of BASIC that included the game on the disc for its PCs. So, before we go into the gameplay of Star Trek and Super Star Trek, let's go over a quick recap because that was a lot of dumping of information. So essentially, Mike Mayfield created Star Trek in 1971 for the Sigma 7. Then he ported it to an HP computer and HP distributed it in their public catalog. Then David Ahl saw this HP version and ported it to the DEC BASIC and published it in his book. Then Bob Leadham saw David Ahl's version and ported it to the Nova. And then David Ahl saw Leadham's version and published it as Super Star Trek in the Basic Games books. So there were several different versions of Star Trek, including what the register calls Apple Trek, which was actually released by Apple for the Apple II mini computer in 1979. They had to change the name to avoid copyright. Acorn Soft released Galaxy, and there was another version called Space Trek. There was also Trek 73 created for HP Timeshared Basic, Star Trek for the Apple I, Star Trek 3 for the TRS-80, Apple II, and Atari 8-bit. There was 3D Star Trek for the Atari 8-bit, and the rest of the many Star Trek games in the 80s. However, Star Trek also appeared on the Commodore PET, the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1, and the RML 380Z. And that's where the complicated history of the first Star Trek games ends. But how does it play? Let's take a look at how the game plays. Firstly, we'll talk about Mike Mayfield's version. The 1971 Star Trek game was text-based, much like many of the games at this time. The player controls the USS Enterprise and flies through the galaxy to fight Klingon warships within a specified time limit. The game has a text-based version of a cutscene at the beginning. The galaxy is laid out on an 8x8 grid of quadrants, and the game starts with a random number of Klingons, starbases, and stars. The game also changes the position of each of these each time a player enters a quadrant on the grid. The player can also view a map of the quadrant they are in by initiating a short-range scan command. A long-range scan will print out a map of the quadrants directly surrounding the player's current one. Combat is not too complicated. Phasers and photon torpedoes are used to attack, and there is no aiming required since this is all text. Instead, the player has to gauge how much power to put into each shot of the phasers. The torpedoes, however, are one-hit kill, but are aimed using what is called polar coordinates. So polar coordinates are a two-dimensional coordinate system. And I don't know enough about math to really explain how that is all calculated, so I'll let you do your own research on that one. On top of the combat, any movement and shields drain the energy of the Enterprise, which can only be restored by visiting a starbase. So let's now get to Super Star Trek, which has some variations on how it is played. With Super Star Trek, there are a lot of similarities, but some differences, including a difficulty level system which will control how smart the Klingon ships are and how many starbases there are. The game also changed the map from 8x8 to a 10x10 grid and added an alien species known as the Thing. No, not that thing. Or maybe. It was essentially marked on the short-range scan as a question mark and would, quote, screech, and Spock would usually make a comment about it. Super Star Trek also featured names for the quadrant such as Rigel 3, even though it has no real relevance other than being a name. So yeah, the Chelons don't make an appearance in this, those weird turtle things. So that is where we're going to end this episode. Star Trek's entrance into video games is quite complicated, and I hope I did a good job about explaining the story here. But it is a really cool look into the side of early game development. In the next episode of Memory Card: The History of Video Games, we'll take a look at a few mainframe games that came out around this time. See you then. As always, I could not make these episodes without my sources, so please go check out all of my sources that I have linked in the description. Definitely take a look at. I've only scratched the surface of the stories that these sources all talk about, and so I definitely recommend you go to read up more information. It's definitely worth a read. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. This was a great episode for me to work on. It was very complicated history. But I'm a big fan of Star Trek, and it was very cool to see just how early Star Trek got into video games and just the development process of how Star Trek evolved in video games. And it was really cool because I'd come across 101 Basic Computer Games in earlier episode research, and it was finally cool to see to really talk about that as this directly involved that with Super Star Trek. So this was a lot of fun to research. This was a really fun episode to work on, and I hope you enjoyed it because it was a longer one because we had a lot to talk about. So I hope you enjoyed this a little bit of a longer episode, and I will see you next week to talk about some mainframe games. See ya.